We've got a good crowd here, so I think we can dive in. So thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2024, Planning Your Stakeholder Mapping Strategy. This is one we love to do every January on this topic because now is really the best time to prepare your stakeholder mapping to set yourself up for a year of success. A few housekeeping items before we dive in. So we use this system called Goldcast that you all are on here. And so for folks who haven't used it yet, a couple important things. So as you can see, folks are using the chat already here on the side. You're welcome to comment throughout the session, use it as you like. We will have time for questions at the end, which you can either put in that chat or in the Q&A functionality just to the right of the chat. We are recording this session, so if you have to drop off, if you'd like to share it with a colleague, it will be sent out later. We will also be sharing out the slides, but you are also able to access those right now in that Docs tab there. If you click Docs, you can download the slides we'll be using here right now. So again, we're going to be running through some content for the first 20-30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have any technical issues, anything like that, feel free to throw that in the chat, and my colleague Molly on the back end will be happy to help out. But first, let's dive in. So first, my name is Teresa Hebert. I am the Director of Communications here at Quorum. My team manages all of the content like this. So if there's anything that you'd like to see in future webinars or different events and speakers, feel free to send them my way. My email is just teresa@quorum.us. And so to start, just want to give an overview for folks who might not be as familiar with Quorum. Quorum is public affairs software that helps you work smarter and move faster. With Quorum, you can map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape all in one place using our solutions for stakeholder engagement, grassroots advocacy, legislative tracking, and PAC management. But three things that make Quorum different is one, with a unified platform, as the policy landscape changes, you have the tools to adapt. Quorum helps you make an impact, then helps you show it off. We're going to talk about that a little bit here today. And then finally, Quorum is committed to supporting customers as they drive innovation in their organizations and beyond. Now, we're not going to talk very much about products today. We're really going to talk strategy. But at the end, if you are interested in learning more about any of Quorum's solutions that can help support your stakeholder engagement efforts, please reach out. We'd be happy to connect you with the right person. But now let's dive into strategy. So our agenda for today, we're going to start with talking at why map stakeholders. What is the benefit to taking this step and executing this process? Then we're going to dive into different methodologies. First, we'll have some beginner or baseline methodologies, and then intermediate and advanced, depending on where your organization is at with your mapping as it stands today. We'll talk goal setting and operationalizing your mapping process. And then finally, how your stakeholder mapping can help with reporting. And again, like I said, questions will follow after that. So first, let's get on the same page about what it is that we're talking about today. What is stakeholder mapping? In line with this idea of beginner, intermediate, advanced methodologies, we wanted to get those kind of beginner, intermediate, advanced definitions. So how would you describe stakeholder mapping in public affairs to a 5-year-old, to a high school grad, to a college grad, to someone with a PhD? So obviously, I don't think any of us are communicating to 5-year-olds, but I thought this one was fun. Stakeholder mapping is like making a picture of all the people who are important. And it's like a treasure map that helps you find the people that you need to talk to. So I love that metaphor. I think it's really fun to describe what we're tackling here today. To a high school graduate, each of these definitions adds a little bit more color. A way to identify and understand the different groups of people who have an interest or stake in an issue. This definition adds who those stakeholders might be. They could be government officials, community leaders, special interest groups, members of the public, your advocates, your PAC donors. By mapping these out, you can understand who you need to engage with and what their concerns are. We add on to that maps metaphor. Helps you navigate through a city, but instead of streets, it shows you the people and groups who are important. Now we're getting farther into these intermediate definitions that stakeholder mapping is a process to identify and analyze. So we're not just figuring out who these people are, we're analyzing their relationship to the issue, whether they're a decision maker, an influencer, an ally, or an opponent. digging into both their positions and motivation so that we can more effectively engage. And then finally, like a PhD, again, we're talking interest and influence. And this definition adds on top of our previous ones with how do you figure out what that interest and influence is, using tools and techniques like interviews, surveys, data analysis to map out those stakeholders. And so these definitions really line up to our beginning, intermediate, advanced we're going to talk through. So at the beginning, you're building your treasure map. Who are the people that I need to know? Second layer of that, we're going to be adding that level of influence. And then third, we're going to be using those tools to map them out in a more advanced way. And for those who are just joining, this session is being recorded and the slides will be sent out, and they are also downloadable right now from the docs section of the window on your right-hand side. You can download those right now. So now that we're on the same page of what stakeholder mapping is, why do we do it? What benefit does that have to our business? So one, we can quickly identify key relationships, knowing which stakeholders to reach out to in different scenarios based on their mapping. We can answer questions like, who is our top stakeholder on healthcare? What stakeholders do we have in Massachusetts? Which team member should reach out to a particular stakeholder? Who should we invite to our next event? So really operational exercises that a lot of our teams do is figuring out who to talk to in different scenarios. Then we can track our engagements with a different level of specificity than just, I met with Senator A, Senator B, Senator C. We can take it to that next level of, are we meeting on our top issues most frequently? Are we meeting with a bipartisan or diverse coalition of stakeholders? Is one of our team members knocking it out of the park with their stakeholder engagement? Or is another team member not keeping pace quite as well? And then finally, and I think most importantly, we can measure the ROI of our stakeholder engagement efforts. So these tiers will make a little more sense as we dive through the presentation, but mapping your stakeholders puts you in a position to be able to show growth and change over time. When you map your stakeholders at the beginning of the year, then map them again at the end of the year and show the categorical change. So again, this will make some more sense as we dive in further here. Oh, I skipped ahead too fast. So our beginner strategy, number one for mapping stakeholders is mapping by team member relationship. Oh, excuse me, sorry about that. Like I said, mapping by team member relationship. And something I want to preface here is when we talk about beginner, another way that I might describe this is baseline. So even if your team is in a position, whether with resources, with time, with your strategic direction, you should still be doing these beginner steps anyway, because they'll make some of your other processes easier. So these stakeholder mapping efforts are not necessarily one and done. You can layer multiple ones on top of each other. So if you're just getting started, these beginner methodologies might be the only ones that you are in a position to tackle this year. Or if your stakeholder engagement is your team's number one priority and you want to get to that advanced level, you should do these ones anyway. So mapping by team member relationship means that every one of your stakeholders is assigned a team member who is responsible for owning and growing that relationship. Why do you do this? Like I said before, it gives you an ability to reflect on which team members are engaging the most or the most effectively. And then there's tactical benefits. If you're using a stakeholder engagement software, you can send messages from the relationship owner. So for example, in Quorum, with our integrated email tool Outbox, one person can write the email and then change the settings so that whoever the assigned relationship owner is, the recipient will appear like they received a personal email from that person. There's a couple different ways that folks will tackle choosing who owns that team member relationship. We know a lot of organizations might have someone who owns all the Democratic relationships and someone who owns all the Republican relationships. There's organizations who might have a House owner and a Senate owner, or someone who owns all of issue A, all of issue B, and the people that fall into those buckets. For some, it's not even that complicated, and they might do a lottery. We've had our CEO shared a story of a company who does kind of like a fantasy draft of which stakeholders folks want to be in charge of building those relationships with. So there's a lot of different ways that team member assignment can work, but it's important that there is a point of contact for each of those stakeholders so that you can best track and manage your engagement, and that there's a friendly face that those people learn to recognize. The second beginner methodology is mapping stakeholders by issue. So for each stakeholder, which issue in your organization's portfolio is most relevant to them? The big benefit of this is sorting your communication efforts. So I think all of us know we get a lot of email. And our stakeholders, especially if they're government officials, are receiving probably 10x the amount of email that we are. And so assigning by issue allows you to filter and only send them the information that's most important to them, like your team's efforts on a particular issue area, your community involvement in an issue, and really drive that better engagement by making sure that you're sharing the information that's most relevant to them. Those are our two basic efforts. Like I said, ones that everyone should be doing, even if you are in a position to apply these more advanced strategies. Those ones are really the operational key baseline setups. Now we're going to move into intermediate, where we get into some more qualitative and quantitative methodologies for mapping stakeholders. And the first one here is this concept of champion, neutral, and detractor. So by mapping stakeholders as champion, neutral, and detractor, you can know who generally supports your issues, who kind of sits in the middle, and who might be a threat to your issues. And the reason that this is intermediate is because when you're assigning champion, neutral, detractor, you're often operating from your gut. You generally know, if I asked you today, I need someone to go sponsor a bill. I need someone to go call their member today to ask them to do something. You generally know who those people are. Or if you said, if this person calls my office, I know that they're going to have a concern. I know that they are going to be introducing something that's in conflict with our stance. You know they're a detractor. And so it's intermediate because you're really kind of operating off of that gut of people you know align into these buckets. Having this mapping is beneficial because of that measurement capability that we showed earlier of tracking. How many people can you grow into champions over a year? How many detractors can you turn neutral based on your engagements? But also, if you have an immediate initiative that you need action on, you can quickly sort by your champions and reach out to them first to really expedite your efforts. A second layer of this intermediate level is issue alignment. So you're not just mapping, so at a basic level, champion, neutral, detractor, everyone has one bucket. In this next step, you can map those stakeholders uniquely based on each issue in your portfolio. So taking those nuances that not everyone is a champion of everything that you care about, but they might be really awesome on one issue. So as a made-up example, you could say that Senator Baldwin is a champion for your organization on healthcare, but a detractor for your organization on transportation. And so depending on the issue you're working on, your champion's neutral detractor will be different. So this is that second layer of that intermediate strategy. Now we get to advanced. We're going to spend the most time here because it does kind of involve the most steps to get here. And this here, we're using a tier system. So we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. In this system, of course, tier 1 is the highest priority, tier 2 in the middle, tier 3 at the bottom. So first, I want to talk through the operational side of this. Then we'll talk about why this strategy works pretty well. So this is really moving from operational mapping, like, operational meaning I want to send an email to my autonomous vehicles stakeholders. I'm going to send that email. That's operational. Here we're talking impact of I want to get something accomplished. Who do I go to? Or I want to move the needle on my issue. Whose opinion do I need to change? So this really is where your strategy comes in, is when you have this information. So here you'll see a grid of interest and influence. Interest being on the x-axis, influence on the y-axis. You want to place your stakeholders along this grid. Like I said, with the champion neutral detractor, you can do this in a kind of gut instinct way of, I know this person well, they champion our issues. But really, if you're taking this advanced step, you want to do it in a more quantitative way of mapping that interest and influence. And by definition, when we talk interest, we mean they're willing to engage on your issue. Influence, they have the actual ability to cause change. So an example of someone who is high interest but low influence. Maybe there's a freshman legislator who is, maybe you're a health organization and a new doctor is elected to Congress and she's a freshman legislator. She probably has high interest on your issue because of her background. However, being a freshman legislator means that she has low influence because she might not get the key committee assignments in her first year, or she might not have the relationships with the full chamber to be able to make change. And so that's where this nuance builds on top of our intermediate strategy. At our intermediate strategy, we know someone loves our issues, but we don't know if they can actually do anything about it. And so an example of high priority would be the inverse of that. Someone who really cares about your issue, has a personal stake in it, has a history of working on that issue, and sits on the key committee or is in a delegation that has a lot of sway. So that is kind of that difference here. How do we map this really at scale? So let's talk first about how to map interest. A data point that we use to map interest is how often is someone talking about this issue? Because we tend to talk about the things that we care about the most. So we can look at social media posting, press releases, statements on the floor, statements in the news. How often are they talking about our issue? And so placing that on a scale of left to right, the people who are talking about the most fall on that high interest side of the spectrum here. Influence, we can look at a couple different things. Committee memberships is absolutely one, but on a quantitative scale, let's look at bills introduced, bills enacted. Obviously, that description is leaning towards government stakeholders who are passing bills as their mechanism of productivity. If you're using, let's go through what it might look like for if your stakeholders are grass tops advocates. Your high interest stakeholders, they might take action on all of your campaigns. They're really excited. And so anytime you send them an email, they're going to send it. The influence might be their ability to host a meeting with a legislator or pick up the phone and get an answer. And so there's definitely different ways that you can take data points, take quantitative metrics, and apply it to these different axes here. So connecting back to tier 1, 2, 3. Tier 1 is in that upper right because they have both interest and influence. Tier 2, we say they have high influence, but low interest. Because if we have to pick between the two, it's easier to spike someone's interest than to spike someone's influence. Think about the storytelling campaigns that teams run or the fly-ins. You have control over the interest by sharing stories, by sharing data. You can't move someone's committee as easily, or you can't, getting someone to introduce a bill is much more difficult. And so that tier 2 is someone who already has influence and they just need to be swayed with their interest. And then tier 3 is people who have that high level of interest, but lower level of influence. They fall in tier 3 because, like I just said, the influence is harder to build, but influence is easier to grow can grow over time, excuse me. That freshman legislator we go back to, eventually, if they are able to hold on to their seat, their influence will grow. And so building that nurturing relationship with those tier 3 has a chance to pay off in the future. If someone falls into that lower left category of low influence and low interest, it's probably not worth your time. That person, if they have low interest, they're not a detractor. They're not going to threaten your bill. They're not going to go speak out against your issue because it's not what they're interested in. So that is really the lowest priority, not the folks you really need to spend time on. So we're going to talk now about, so now we understand our tier 1, our tier 2, our tier 3, and how those people end up in those buckets. Now we're going to talk about what we do about it and how your organization can use this mapping to build stronger relationships. Because with this system of mapping, just because someone is tier 1 doesn't mean that you have a relationship with them yet. This tiering system is purely based on where they sit in the policy landscape. And so now we take this mapping and apply it to how you can grow your relationship. So to set the level of what is our relationship with each of these tiers, we have 5 criteria. Number 1 is 5 steps of a ladder is, I guess, a better way to describe it. The bottom rung is that you have no relationship. The second rung, they know your team. The third rung, they know your issues. The fourth rung, they support your issues. And the fifth rung, they take action on your behalf when they're asked. So you could have tier 1, 2, and 3 stakeholders fall into any of these 5 levels. So you could have tier 1 stakeholders, the most important, who you don't know yet. Or who don't, you could have tier 2 stakeholders who know your issues very well, while others just know your team. You could have tier 3 stakeholders who take action when asked. So folks can fall all over the spectrum. But obviously, in an ideal world, you would have all your tier 1 stakeholders at level 5, where the most influential take action on your team's behalf because they're in lockstep with you. And so when you put these two things together, the level of interest and influence combined with understanding of their levels is where you can start setting your goals. How are you defining support in number 4 is a great question. I think that there's a couple of ways that you could think about this. An example that I think of is if a vote comes to the floor, they will vote in your favor, but they are not going to be the one who introduces it. Or they will take your meeting and agree with you, but there's not a lot of action coming out on the other end. Someone says 2 and 3 are pretty close because if they know the team, they know who is talking about what issue. That's very fair. We think about how folks move around organizations and they bring their relationships with them is, I guess, where the nuance would come in there. Is someone might be new to an organization, but they have a really strong relationship because they worked with that person, or the organization they were at before in their previous role worked with that office. So totally fair that those ones will probably be the easiest to jump in tandem. But there are some circumstances where those could be nuanced. So now we're going to jump into kind of goal setting and how this applies to these. So you've done the job of mapping everybody. The big hurdle of, at the beginning of the year, understanding what the status quo is of tiers and of that ladder of 5 steps. Now you're going to set a goal. And so an example of a goal would be to move 20% of our tier 1 stakeholders from knows our issues to supports our issues. Now, depending on how you're setting up, that might not be the right first goal. Instead, you might want to simply move from no relationship to knows your team if you know that you're in a long fight on the issue that you're working on. So there's lots of different goals, not saying that this is the one everybody needs to tackle, but as an example. And so if you're working from knows our issues to supports our issues, that will determine what steps might be most beneficial to achieve that goal. So if you're trying to move someone to supports your issues, you're going to want to share stories and data to really sway them, as opposed to just stories and data that show a stance rather than highlight why an issue is important to care about. So we might host an in-district meeting at our facilities to show them what it would mean to support your stance. You might identify or nurture a grass tops advocate for each tier 1 so that those people can share stories out and be that face-to-face, more personal relationship. Or you might send a monthly email that shows your community efforts to really show that you are an organization that they should align with. So your steps will be different depending on your goals. If your goal, like the other example I gave, if your goal is to build relationships, move them from no relationship to knows our team, from level 1 to level 2, then you're probably going to DC and setting up those 15-minute conversations with the key staffer on your issue, a lower bar than bringing them in district, or different things like that. Just to get your face in, tell them who you are, not worry about swaying them quite yet. So the goals and steps come after that mapping, but the mapping is really critical to setting you up to be able to measure and know if you've achieved those things. Another way that you can help achieve those goals is, another way that having your stakeholder map complete is beneficial to your strategy is because it helps plan your communications. So we have an article on our website about a policy reputation calendar. Now, the concept of a policy reputation calendar is building a cadence of emails to your stakeholders that helps share information, share updates, and is not asking them to do things. We all know how frustrating it is when we're kind of asked out of the blue to do a project, to sign on to something, but we haven't built up that understanding of why it's important. And so that's what this calendar of communications helps you to do. And so you'll see here a color coding system. A color is assigned to each issue. And so we make sure that we have a communication for each issue spread throughout the month. So we have energy as our number 1 issue that has the most communications with 3. Because we did that mapping by issue, we can send those communications out to the people who we know energy is their top priority. Data privacy and transportation might be our second level key issues of the year. So we do a little bit less communication on those 2. But still, because we did that baseline mapping of which issue to assign to which stakeholder, we can make sure that we're getting the right message to the right people. Now, I think lots of us know, like, this system is great. It sounds awesome, but my team's never going to do it. To get them to make updates here or to keep clean data is really hard. And we totally recognize that. So a couple methodologies that we've seen work with organizations who do these kinds of things, we're going to walk through now. So first, you probably all have department meetings with the people who are responsible for your stakeholder engagement. So one way is to have a once a quarter meeting, use one of those meetings once a quarter to update your stakeholder map. So that information is a little bit fresher than waiting until the end of the year. Second, we have folks who report on adoption of stakeholder mapping processes of interaction logging as part of their performance reviews. So making it clear through that review process, or however often that you and your teams do that, that their execution of and keeping this data up to date is one of those criteria that you're looking at for a successful team member. And finally, we've seen people provide incentives for those who stay up to date on mapping stakeholders. Things as small as cupcakes in the office for the folks who are doing the best job of logging their meetings or logging their notes. So next, set a standard for what's included in your team's tracking so data is clean and consistent. Some of those rules that we have, that we recommend that all meetings with stakeholders are logged within 24 hours of meeting completion. We all know how busy our days are and how you can have a meeting or a conversation and the next day, the details are fuzzy. So 24 hours is really a maximum we recommend. That's one of the reasons why Quorum has a mobile system for logging interactions. So you can do it when you're walking from meeting to meeting, when you're in a cab coming back to your office, any of those things. Second is standardized fields on all your interactions. So make a decision on what the most important information is and add it into your whatever system you're using to track your engagements. Some people like to use meeting sentiment, like positive, neutral, negative. Some people want to tag the issue that was discussed. Set up a system of what details every engagement interaction must include. And then finally, if you're using a more advanced system, Quorum or something else, we can set up things like team permissions that dictate who is allowed to update stakeholder mapping. So let's say you have a 20-person team. You all want them to view your stakeholders and how they're mapped, but they shouldn't have the power to make that change. And only a subset, maybe 5 people, have the ability to change how they're mapped, consider them tier 1 instead of tier 2. We can set up rules in the system where that locks it down to only those key people. And then finally, reporting is what we talked about, one of the key reasons that we're doing all of this. So some of the KPIs that this system lets you set up. First, you can track the number of interactions with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. What's the growth of tier 1 over time? Which team member is having the highest number of interactions? Which issues are we having the most interactions on? What number of our meetings are we coming out of with positive, neutral, and negative sentiment? And so certainly don't need to do all of these. Can decide, like we said, what your goal is here, and align your KPIs to that. And then finally, if you're using a system like Quorum, we can automate a lot of this. So setting up, these are Quorum dashboards. You can set up the information that's important for you to know, have it auto-updating as information is added to the system, and even share these out with your C-suite executives if that is something that you are sharing up to a higher level of your organization. And really key, the reason we do this webinar in January is starting early. The earlier you start in the year, the more your strategy can be built around this system, the more you can measure over a long period of time and know if your system is having an impact. And then finally, to explain for folks who might be interested in Quorum, which products they would need to use. If your stakeholders are officials, you're going to want either Quorum federal, state, local, or international. If you're most concerned with tracking advocates, that will be Quorum Grassroots, where we have a full database. You can follow your advocates, the amount that they're engaging. And then finally, if your stakeholders are third party, community members, association members, coalition members, Quorum Stakeholder is going to be right for you. And then finally, if you're tracking your PAC donors, then Quorum PAC is going to be the right answer. So those are all of my slides. It looks like we've got some questions started. Feel free to keep throwing them in there and we will start going through them. So the first question I saw, does it apply to stakeholders who are not officials? It absolutely does. We have lots of folks, like I said, using Quorum's stakeholder engagement tool, Quorum Stakeholder, to track non-government folks in their community affairs. Obviously, those quantitative metrics of how we determine influence might be different. It's possible you could track influence based on their job title and move up from associates to directors to vice presidents on their level of influence. You could have, if you are tracking coalition members, you could track based on the number of employees they have and the number of influence that they have in the group. So while it might not be quite as black and white as some of those high volume metrics like number of bills introduced, it absolutely can be done. And each of these methods really can be tweaked to what is most important to your organization. So I think there's a lot of flexibility with different folks here. Can I go into the automation more in detail? Absolutely. So Quorum dashboards was that visual that we showed here. And Quorum dashboards are set up to pull information from other parts of the system. So say you want to set this up for the first time, you would set your dashboard up to decide which metrics are important to you. We do have a team that can help advise on things like that for customers. And then as you put information into the system, those will continue to auto update. So for example, if you're using Quorum, anytime you meet with a stakeholder, you log that meeting. When you go back to your dashboard and you're tracking who's meeting the most, those graphs will be updated. So it is kind of a live system that folks can come in and reflect on. Can I show the things you discussed would be done in Quorum? I can jump into that after a couple of these other questions, and I will switch my screen here. What level of detail do we need to add for meeting notes? Is the specifics around sentiment, positive, neutral, more important to track? We see a lot of different preferences here, and the baseline that I would say is do what you think your team is most likely to follow through on and keep clean data on. And so at the very basic, For someone who's never done meeting tracking before, we might just say, make sure you include the people who are in the room and 2 sentences of notes, because that has benefits at an even simpler level of, if my colleague met with Senator A last week and I'm going to meet with Senator A this week, I want to know what was talked about so I don't sound like I'm uninformed. So at a baseline, I would say, do the thing that you think people will execute on. As you want to build upon that, I would say issue is the first one that I would add, because it's probably more black and white than positive neutral. It's probably, most people have a pretty clear understanding of how they categorize their issues. And so that is the first one that I would add. And then I would align around your goals. If your goal is to grow those positive relationships, and grow someone from neutral to champion, then tracking that meeting sentiment is valuable, because that might be a way that you know if you've achieved it. If someone is neutral, but you're consistently having positive meetings, it might be fair to call them a champion at the end of the year. Whereas if they go back and forth, they might be still in that neutral place. So I really would say, determine your goals and then figure out what the tracking sentiment, what the tracking should include. Some examples of what standardized fields from interactions are could be. So I think that I hopefully answered some of that there, but it's in Quorum, if that helps describe, a custom field is like if you're filling out a form and you have a multi-select option to answer a question, whereas broad might be filling out an open-ended answer. And so, like I was saying to the question before, if there's things that you want to know from a set selection, those custom fields will be valuable. If you're looking at broad, then just filling out a description of the meeting. Does Quorum allow you to change the quadrants? So yes, we that interest and influence description is not labeled in the system. So there is some flexibility to how you describe that internally. That is one of the examples I'll show in just a second. And how to do this in Quorum. Great. The difference between 2 and 3, we touched on a little bit earlier. Knows team versus knows issues is the question there. And my answer would be they are very similar and probably the 2 that you can achieve in tandem if you're engaging for the first time. But we know there are some more enterprise organizations or if you are using a consulting lobbying firm where the folks might know the name more than they know who they are advocating on behalf of. As folks change jobs, as they change which issue they're working on in the portfolio, is kind of the way that I would show that nuance. Not all stakeholders are from the same industry or engage in the same issue. Can users categorize stakeholders in Quorum? Absolutely. I think that is a way I would use that stakeholder alignment visual that we showed earlier, where instead of, or someone could be a champion in one issue and a detractor in another. You can tag folks to multiple issues. You don't have to pick just one. And issue in Quorum is a very broad term. If you wanted to tag by industry, you could do that as well. And the exact same technical mechanism, you could just label them as your industry categories instead of your issue categories. That's a great question.